when one discipline tickles another one, those are the places of innovation and opportunity, right? Because everybody frames problems differently and brings different tool sets to different issues.
Most of us are too busy with the present to think far into the future. Work, kids, pets, and other obligations can make it feel like planning for anything more than a week away is a fool's errand. But we also live in a time of rapid change where technologies from biological design to artificial intelligence threaten to mold the future in ways we might have trouble imagining. So it's comforting to know that we have bright, creative minds at work thinking about how we might change course to create a more positive future.
Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley are the authors of Assembling Tomorrow, a guide to designing a thriving future. Both authors work at Stanford's D.school, where Carissa is the academic director and Scott is creative director. In this episode, we learn why they wrote the book and how we might rethink our design processes in light of the rapid change brought on by AI. We also discuss how we might shift our thinking from short-term gains to look at our moment in time from a broader perspective.
This is Design Better, where we explore creativity at the intersection of design and technology. I'm Eli Woolery.
And I'm Aaron Walter. You can get ad-free episodes, bonus content, discounted workshops, and access to our monthly AMAs with big names in design and tech by becoming a Design Better premium subscriber. It's also the best way to support the show. Visit designbetterpodcast.com/subscribe to learn more. We'll return to the conversation after this quick break.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
And now, back to the show.
Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley, welcome to the Design Better podcast.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Thanks, Eli.
I get to see both of your lovely faces quite often when we're stomping around the D.school, but this is the first time I've had a chance to interview you, and I'm really excited about it.
Us too.
Looking forward to it.
Cool. Well, let's start with a very basic question, and you may get asked this by other interviewers too, but Aaron and I are both curious, why'd you write the book right now? It seems like a really important subject, but also a challenging one, especially given how fast things are changing right now. Yeah, why'd you write the book?
Yeah, we wrote this book. It's called Assembling Tomorrow, and it's really about this runaway design moment that we feel like we're in right now, where the technologies that we are building with are going on to make changes beyond what they were even initially designed for. And it's happening kind of like a runaway train. So when we say runaway design, we mean like a runaway train where you can't put the brakes on the thing because it's flying down the tracks and it might crash and it might break something. But the thing is, with a runaway train, you see that it's crashed. It's visibly spilled something or caused some destruction. But with the tech that we are really building with today, like artificial intelligence, like synthetic biology, where we're hacking together DNA, these types of technologies are invisible. And we might not know that they're out there and causing harm unless we're super intentional and thoughtful about how and why we build with them. And as designers, we're building all the time. And our book is both an examination of this moment and also quite optimistic as to what might we do about it.
I'm glad you're optimistic. I I confess to have a slightly less optimistic view, but I feel like for the past 70, 80 years, a little bit longer, we have been wrestling with incredible technologies with incredible powers, but we get progressively worse and worse at really thinking through all of the possible implications. The moment we dropped an atomic bomb on Japan, we knew, wow, this is big. This is incredible power. And so we immediately need to think through all the ramifications. What are the political structures we need? What are the global treaties that we need? What are the security measures we need to put into place to protect this technology? You mentioned, Carissa, CRISPR, DNA splicing, and so forth to be able to biologically engineer different plants, animals, etc. If you read Walter Isaacson's book called Code Breakers, it's about Jennifer Doudna and everything that happened around CRISPR. Similar thing, like, hey, we're making this thing super exciting. Holy cow, this could be really bad. And they start to create these structures. Now let's jump over to our world, technology. It's all optimism and it's absolutely no boundaries. In fact, it's the antithesis. It's like, don't tread on me. We want to do whatever the hell we want to do. We've got these great intentions. What could go wrong because we're out here to save the world? What's going on in the tech world that is so different from the history of all these other places where technology has had such a huge influence?
I think in technology, where it begins is a little bit different. So you have in the examples that you gave, both the atomic bomb and CRISPR and biotechnology, a lot of those began in very regulated situations or in situations where the technology had to be owned by, say, a governmental agency. The scale of it was so big that really governments were the only ones who could handle it. And with technology, that happened at the beginning, right? Like a lot of the early internet stuff was military stuff that then, even GPS. But it immediately went into commercial territory. And the incentives in commercial territory are just so much different. And even in the beginnings of technology, if you look back at, say, like the movements around technology in the 60s, they're so optimistic. It's like, we're going to connect to the world. We're going to save the world. It's going to bring everybody together. And that's really admirable. But there's a certain point where you start to reach limits. And I think the limits were readily apparent, say, with the atomic bomb right away. And it's taken longer to reach those limits on the tech side. But the thing is limits, at least in the way we look at it, are really useful. In fact, in design, everyone talks about constraints. Like, we got to use constraints. Constraints are the key to good design. And that's absolutely true. But somehow in the sort of race to commercialization, we've kind of lost that thread that actually designing for the limits themselves, trying to figure out like where the limits are, creates a much better design. And I think it really just has to do with the fact that it didn't kind of grow up in a very regulated way. It kind of just started as a melee and continues. And of course, like, I'm excited about a lot of the things. There are a lot of great technological innovations that have come along during the years, and they've been wonderful. And a lot of those predictions are right. But there's an edge where it gets scary once it gets as powerful as it's getting right now.
You also see the destruction from an atomic bomb. And a lot of the harm coming from today's technologies is much more invisible, right? You only see the effect farther down the road because you see how people have been harmed or decisions that are being made based on, the AI, predicting certain populations of people won't repay their mortgages. And so that then they are discriminated against based on what was programmed in that algorithm. It's less of a bomb drop and more of a trickle down.
More subtle.
I actually think that we all do see the repercussions, but we just don't have a collective understanding of it. So when you see an atomic bomb, we all see like that is destruction. That is massive destruction. But when we see our 12-year-old daughters, our 14-year-old sons getting lost in their phones, having suicidal ideation, we see that, but we feel like, it's just me. It's just my family. But it's actually, it takes someone like Jonathan Haidt to do the research and publish that and say, actually, this is a trend and we can map this. There's a strong correlation to technology, the things we created with good intent that are having really damaging repercussions on our children.
I think this is a really great point. And it gets to a larger point, which is that we tend to think of things as personal responsibility. And there is really a collective action, a collective coordination that has to happen to make these things work on our behalf, meaning on the behalf of people. Because at the level of individual responsibility, there's a lot you can do, but there's a certain point where it just gets away from you because of the way competition works, the way people pull in and start using technologies, and how if you don't use a technology, it actually becomes a liability for you. Like if you're not online or if you're not using X app, you're kind of opting out and you're missing out. And so really there does need to be some collective action around this. And that's a tricky thing. We're not the best at that, humankind at large scale.
So Chris and Scott, I was looking at the sort of excerpt from the book you sent over, and there's a really interesting quote that says, "The major problems in the world are a result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think." And it got me thinking about this example that John Maeda often shares regarding the kind of massive progress of generative AI and recently. And it's this idea of doubling and exponential values. And they use this example of like sort of a pond weed that doubles every day. And as humans, we're not really used to exponential functions and how they work. And then in the pond example, you can ask somebody like, when does the pond, become completely full? And it's, the day before it's half full and the next day it's full. And this is better. We'll link to a visual representation because it's easier to understand. But kind of the general idea is that we as humans have a hard time predicting something if it's exponential. And I'm wondering if that's kind of what he was getting at in this idea of nature versus the way people think, or if there's other things to unpack there that you all investigated in the book.
I love that thought of the pond being totally filled the day after it's almost half full. That way of framing it feels just really easy to grasp. I mean, I think the other element that we bring in the book is through the lens of time and pace. We talk about Stewart Brand's pace layers and how the pace that we make decisions as humans, especially with today's technology, is very, very fast. And we are living in a world that has equated efficiency and speed with progress, right? And productivity. And we don't think that that's necessarily helpful. Nature has its own speed, which is often much slower, right? It regulates, it absorbs change that are caused by humans and the systems that humans create. But when we are building and creating technologies that actually alter nature, where nature's responding to us, right? It is warming the planet and we're having to compensate in return. So I think there's these two swirling things. One is that we are artificially obsessed with speed and making things go faster. And we should unpack what and why that has come to pass. And then the second is that nature is responding to the actions that we're making, right? We are seeing the effects of the decisions made in the Industrial Revolution now, this many years later. And we're still making decisions today that will have repercussions with nature. So we should go down both those roads. I'd love to go down both those roads.
I'll add, too, that one of the main conundrums, I think, of society at large and why it feels like such a precarious moment is that we're extremely good at creating. We're very good at making things. And we're extremely bad at understanding the downstream impacts of the things we make until they get there. So we have this huge gap between our ability to make and our ability to understand the impacts. That's the drama of our existence on this planet. And on top of that, as Carissa was talking about with those pace shifts, we are speeding up things that had a certain pace before, and just changing that pace alone has impacts. So we think of synthetic biology as artificial evolution. Well, evolution works at a certain pace, right? It's going at its pace. It's a very slow pace. We're now speeding that pace up, and we have been for years just through breeding. But now with synthetic biology, we're speeding it up even more. And changing that pace then speeds up the impacts of those things. And since we're not good at predicting those impacts, it puts us in, a slightly, maybe more than slightly, a precarious situation. It also increases the power of these things too. And I guess the last thing I would say is there's a guy named Ted Nelson who had an alternative internet back in the 60s that he called Xanadu. And he's been trying to build it ever since. Yeah. And he had this awesome word, which is intertwingularity, which just means that like everything is interconnected and intertwined. Everything has repercussions on everything else. And I think that's the thing that we're not great at seeing, is sort of that ripple that happens when we do something, and how when we do one thing, it changes everything. And we just haven't come to grips with that. We're aware of it, but we don't really understand it, I don't think.
I can't help but think that all these things that you just pointed out that we're not good at, not seeing how things are connected, not being able to see the repercussions of, it's almost an unpredictable chess game in front of us, and our obsession with speed. I mean, maybe this is something that AI could help us with, that these models could help us see these are the possible implications that are in front of us.
Something I like to think about is if you actually look at the data from the U.S. Department of Labor on American productivity, since around the year 2000, you look at those curves. Around 2008, our productivity has not increased exponentially. It's almost flatlined. But if you want to call it our efficiency, the speed of our microprocessors has continued to increase exponentially. So there's this huge gap between how fast we are able to do this computing work and what our actual productivity looks like. And what happened around 2008? Well, that's when we got our iPhones, when smartphones started really in earnest, when all the apps built on top of them to constantly ding, 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 you have a notification, you can be working at all times, computers in our pocket for real this time, right? So like our technology really started to, maybe quote unquote, be a lot faster, a lot more efficient, but our productivity hasn't increased in turn. And I think it's time that we have like a reckoning with that gap, because the AI is only going to accelerate the speed at which we can do things. We're seeing that already. So if we don't think really hard about what we're like, are we going to really make space to take time to reflect and relax and do very meaningful work? Or are we going to continue to try to fit in too much, right? And to make ourselves accessible at all hours?
These are definitely messy times, exciting times. And Scott, you had this quote when you reached out, first letting people know about your book, that if you had to sum up the book in 10 words or less, it's about finding hidden opportunities in these messy times. So, there's many directions somebody could take here. We've been running these AI workshops, and there's a lot of kind of excitement, but also a lot of fear around what's going on. And maybe in both of your perspectives, what are those hidden opportunities that we might be able to kind of probe and discover right now in times that are kind of messy and kind of scary?
I think the main thing that's happening, particularly with AI, is that it's coming into our relationships, right? Like it's getting in the middle of our work relationship, it's getting in the middle of our personal relationships, and it's going to keep doing that. When that happens, it's kind of disorienting, right? I think it puts you a little bit off kilter. So I think the first thing is to like step back, stay calm, and then to start poking at it, right? And once you're calm, you can start looking for like, well, what is this doing? And it's coming at us so fast that you can almost look one step ahead, because next week that thing's going to come to fruition. So you can let your imagination go forward a little bit. One of the things we think about is all the different ways that we think. And I think the main thing to think about right now is you are operating in ignorance. None of us knows what's going to happen. Even the people creating it don't totally get it. So when you're operating in ignorance, you shed having to be right, and you can start to play with, how do I expose where I'm wrong? Or how do I find where there's something that I can't see right now? So there are different ways of going through that. We think of them as serial thinking, sort of sequential thinking. and spatial thinking, which is looking for patterns. Serials are things like just using logic, telling stories. Spatial is more like metaphors that show patterns, and maps where you can kind of look at everything. We're using maps broadly there. Could be graphs, any sort of data processing. But what you can do is step back and just interrogate the way you're thinking about it. So the thing about AI is everyone's got a mental model of what this is. And I'm kind of collecting those as people talk about them. And, some people, it's the atomic bomb. And so we need to have treaties. And this is an existential threat. Other people, it's a calculator for words, meaning it's just a tool. This isn't that different than anything else. I've heard people talk about it as like, this is like manufacturing rugs. It used to be that we'd write stories from scratch, and now they'll just be written for us. But it's no different than like a Weaver versus IKEA, and that brings up certain things. So like you just kind of constantly listen for these metaphors and make sure you don't get caught in one. That's the big thing, is if you get caught in one, then you're only seeing one teeny little slice of what's going on. But to like get used to letting them go. So it's really like less being confident and more being curious. And that's where things open up.
We'll return to the conversation after this quick break.
Support for Design Better comes from our friends at CrashPlan. Visit crashplan.com/designbetter for 50% off your first year of CrashPlan. From my daughter's first birthday to my son's first soccer game, if you're like me, you have thousands of precious family photos that only exist in digital form. That's why I've been using CrashPlan for a decade and a half now to back up all my important files. CrashPlan works efficiently in the background while you work, encrypting and sending all your new or changed files up to their secure cloud server every 15 minutes. And they make it simple to restore some or all of your data. And with unlimited version retention, CrashPlan can also be your ultimate rewind button. Businesses of all sizes benefit from CrashPlan's multi-tenant capabilities. Buy as many user licenses as you need and easily manage them all under one account. Go to crashplan.com/designbetter for 50% off your first year of CrashPlan. That's crashplan.com/designbetter, all one word, for 50% off your first year. Back up better with CrashPlan.
This message is sponsored by Greenlight. One of the greatest gifts that my parents gave me is the basics of financial literacy. And now, as a parent to a 14 and a 10-year-old, I want to pass on that same literacy so my kids are set up for success in life. So years ago, I set up our boys with Greenlight, a debit card and money app made for families. Their allowance is automatically deposited into their account Friday evenings, and it's divided into 3 buckets: spending, saving, and giving. With Greenlight's investing tools, I've helped my kids learn how to invest in stocks and mutual funds, and they've been able to watch those investments grow. This past January, my boys each made charitable contributions of their own money in sizable amounts to nonprofits doing work that they believe in, and that was only possible because Greenlight automatically sets aside money from their allowance. They're so proud of what they did, and I gotta say, so am I. I talk to my kids about money all the time, but the lessons that hit home the most are the ones that come from the real world. They're able to be independent with a debit card and track their money in the Greenlight app. Before you know it, your kids are going to be leaving home to build a life. Do they have the financial literacy that they need for success? Greenlight can help you prepare them. Sign up for Greenlight today and get your first month free when you go to greenlight.com/designbetter. That's greenlight.com/designbetter to try Greenlight for free. Greenlight.com/designbetter. Do you have a bucket list? I sure do. And like 25% of Americans, learn a new language is on my list. I started learning some Japanese in college and high school, but I definitely needed a thorough brush up. And I'd love to pick up some French, so I'm picking up Babbel. It's helping me move closer to my goals. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts, and they help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. This is practical stuff in a conversational format that I personally have found much easier to pick up and retain. Plus, Babbel's speech recognition technology helps you to improve your pronunciation and accent. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Lots of people trust it because it works. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. And here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, you can get 60% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/designbetter. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/designbetter, spelled BABBEL.com/designbetter. Rules and restrictions may apply. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works.
Design Better is supported by HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. Whether you're cooking for yourself or your family, it's hard to keep up with meal planning, grocery shopping, and cooking. At the end of a busy workday, it's hard to muster the energy to put together a healthy meal. Cut down on time spent in the kitchen so you can get back to enjoying the summer sunshine and the people you love, thanks to HelloFresh's quick and easy recipes. Every week's menu features options that are ready in 20 minutes or less. That's even quicker than delivery. Also, if your kids are like mine, it's sometimes hard to get them to eat a healthy meal, and you end up making 2 dinners, one for adults and one for kids. HelloFresh's line of kid-friendly recipes are picky eater-proof and perfect for families looking to shake up their dinner recipe rotation while school's out for the summer. Go to hellofresh.com/designbetterapps for free appetizers for life. 1 appetizer item per box while subscription is active. That's free appetizers for life at hellofresh.com/designbetterapps.
And now, back to the show. How should we be rethinking our design process to account for these things?
Well, one is, I think, if we think, even just riffing off of what Scott was just saying about like serial and spatial, maintaining multiple possibilities throughout. I think designers are already good at holding multiple things as possible trajectories. This is the navigating ambiguity element that many thrive with, right? And we're great at testing ideas, etc. But I think we can get better at, like, when this thing that I'm building is launched into the world, like, I have the highest of hopes for it. We all have the best of intentions. Like, nobody's setting out to break things. But when everything goes right, what still will go wrong? What system is this going to break in the near term, 10 years out, 100 years out? I don't think in our design work to date, we are great at that super long-term thinking yet. I think we've got a lot to learn from Indigenous communities, from other disciplines that do a lot of backwards looking and forwards looking as part of their practices already. And I think that we can, we get excited to make things. Like, that's part of the designer special sauce, is like, we make our thing, we launch it, great, right? But what about shepherding it into the future and practicing, as we're creating, like, here's different scenarios of the things that might go wrong when we make this. And if so, here's what I'm going to do, right? And how are we showing up when that does happen? Even if it's 10 years after I've left the project, like, do I have responsibility there? We haven't really had those kinds of conversations as a community yet. How do our responsibilities track through time? I'd love to see the design community have that conversation.
I think that's great. And one thing that we can use AI as a tool for, and obviously it's not going to replace those human conversations you just mentioned, Carissa, but it can be a tool to help us think about, you can type it directly in ChatGPT, how might this new product I'm developing negatively affect the community where it's going to be used? And it will springboard up a bunch of ideas. Some of them might be silly or nonsensical, but at least will get you thinking, and maybe as a starting point for those conversations. And then, Scott, I really like the idea that you said about curiosity versus confidence. I think in our design program and as designers more broadly, we're often taught to help people build their creative confidence as a skill, which I think is still really relevant. But now there's also this curiosity element. And I think just being able to play with some of these tools and be curious about them is a really great way to get more comfortable with them, with the idea that there's inevitably going to be things that you run up against or hallucinations or problems. But if you're playing with them and you kind of understand a little better what their strengths and limitations are, they remove some of the fear, and that curiosity can really give you a leg up. I'm not sure if either of you want to speak more to that.
I think that's absolutely right. My brother, who's a psychologist, has this saying where he talks about how when you're overwhelmed, it's really hard to be curious. And when you're curious, it's really hard to be overwhelmed. I mean, it's kind of this amazing thing of like, when you have that curiosity, that's where all these opportunities open up. And even the creative confidence as an idea, really what it is being okay with a situation that you've never seen before. Like, okay, I can work through this is kind of the idea of creative confidence. And really what that's about is curiosity. And I think the more we can be looking for what's working and what's not working, the better off we're going to be. I think a lot of times we do things and we want them to work immediately. And we're just in a situation where we can't be sure that that's going to happen. And I think that's okay. It's just a different way of thinking. It's tricky, but it's doable.
What do you think about the necessity of multidisciplinary thinking today? It occurs to me that one of the challenges that we face is that we're so specialized. And so when someone is very specialized, they can go deep on that subject. I'm a great engineer. I'm a really great designer. But, do I understand geopolitics? Do I understand philosophy? And all of these other disciplines that would play a role in the things that I'm making and the outcomes that are unforeseen. How do you think about that?
I mean, I think that there's no way we'll all understand all the things, which is why we need to work on the spaces in between our disciplines. There's just this incredible magic that happens when one discipline tickles another one. Those are the places of innovation and opportunity, right? Because everybody frames problems differently and brings different tool sets to different issues. And I think designers are naturally good at that translation. But one thing that we feel is really important right now is the need for this material literacy in today's technologies. And by that, I mean, how does somebody who's not a coder, not a technologist, understand, again, not how to technically code that AI, but has a sense for what those algorithms can do? Because if I'm literate in the types of things a classification algorithm can do, even if I don't know how to code one, I'm able to talk about what types of problems in my own work it might be used for and when it might be useful. And even if you're not a technologist, you can get better at asking somebody who does code, hey, how does that work? Tell me what it is you're working on. And when they answer and it doesn't make sense the first time, can you tell me again, what does that mean? Get our technologists, we should all be putting them to task to speak in plain speak. Everybody's discipline has their lingo, right? We should all be trying to translate and make sure each other has a sense for what it is we're actually doing. And I think that we often worry that we come across as embarrassing not to know, right? Or we pretend to understand. But I think we can all normalize the not knowing, right? And asking you to state it again and then state it again once more.
There's a great Marshall McLuhan quote, mid-century media theorist. And he says, depth is a matter of interrelating. Really, the magic is in when we work together, when we see what each other are doing, the discoveries in the overlaps. And I think that's really true now in particular. And the thing about technologists is I love them. I'm friends with them. They get really focused on the potential and not necessarily the effects, right? So we all have a role in figuring out what the effects are because we're experts in the effects. And anyone listening to this, you see something happening, see something, say something, right? It's notice that. We all have a role here in helping illuminate what's going on for each other because nobody knows. It's moving so fast.
It seems also that one sort of corollary effect of what's happening with generative AI is it's inevitably going to cause some blurring of disciplines. So traditionally, at least in the software world, we have this idea of designers and engineers, and there's some disciplines that kind of cross the boundaries, front end or design engineering, those types of things. But now with these tools like ChatGPT, as a designer, I can actually go in, and I'm not a developer. I played around with it before, but now I can ask it to help me code an app. And when it doesn't work, I can tell it it's not working. Why is that? I can have a dialogue that, for one, allows me to create a little prototype on my own. But on the other hand, it also helps me understand the process better. And when I go to actually make something that's going to be, let's say, shipped to the real world, I can have a more informed dialogue with somebody who is actually doing the real engineering work. And I think over time, it might become more and more the fact that an individual can own different parts of these processes, or at least understand them better. And I'm curious if either of you have thought or talked about in the book this kind of like blurring of lines between disciplines and what that means for us.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things pop into my head there. One is that by making the interface human language, all these generative AIs, whether they're helping with coding or helping with understanding a topic, it immediately makes things accessible to people who haven't had access before. So from an educational standpoint, it's really unbelievable. The ability for someone to be able to describe what they want something to do rather than having to create the nuts and bolts of it. It'd be almost as if I could say, build me a car. No, make it wider. I meant 3 rows. I mean, just it's really, really stunning and amazing.
The danger is you end up with the Homer Simpson version of the car, if you remember that episode back in the day.
That is exactly the danger. And this gets into this idea of limits, right? Like we still do need these limits, right? The thing about beautiful things from the past were often beautiful because we only had certain materials to work with, like metal and brick and glass. They look good together no matter what you do. As soon as you get into plastics and rubbers and whatever, you can do whatever, and then it looks like whatever, and then we get this world that's kind of messy, right? So that's exactly the danger, and it's a real danger, although I think it's a funny example. So anyway, you get this situation where people who haven't been able to participate before can now participate, and then that opens up all kinds of collaborative opportunities. And I think the 2 things standing in the way of things going well in this sort of opportune and perilous moment, one is, can we see the things that we're missing? And I do think AI can help with that. It can help model outcomes, things like that. And the other is, can we work together? And I think AI can help with that too. And if we can answer those 2 things and we can leverage the tools to do that, we're going to be in good shape. If we can't, we're not. And it can go either way. It's really up to us. Like, do we want to bring things together or do we want to let them fly apart?
One build on that too, and thinking from our perspective as educators too, is we're very well aware that we're working with students today and preparing them for jobs that do not exist yet. And those jobs are at those disciplinary blurs. We're working on the thing being the new humans that we're putting out into the world as designers. And we don't really know the world that they're going to be entering into. And we'll never know. So we have to be open to the blur and like aware of those limits. And it's a lot to entertain, but there's a lot of positive that can come from it.
So you already sort of touched on this, but tell us why you're optimistic about the next 5-10 years. What do you see happening in a maybe not utopian, but let's say not dystopian unfolding of the world?
I'll go back to our students, right? The types and scales of problems that they are coming to college, to graduate school, eager to work on, it's incredible. Where I think 10, 15, 20 years, students would come, do a design school, at least at Stanford, and really focus on building a product of sorts, physical, maybe a digital product in near years. Now we're seeing this desire to work on big systems level issues that have multiple ways in. We have students that are both looking to, in recent years, for graduate students, we had the team of Gabby Dweck and Kelly Redman launch this company called Oleo, which is creating a synthetic replacement for palm oil. And if you don't know, palm oil is that thing that's in absolutely everything that you've touched that you don't even realize. So it's probably in your toothpaste, your shampoo, and the crackers you just ate as a snack. And it's one of those sleeper things that in recent history, we wouldn't have seen design students feeling compelled to work on or even have the tool set for. But with today's technology and with the students' mindset, they feel like they can make a dent in problems at that scale. And so, like, more than anything, seeing that type of creative confidence come up through students is what gives me hope.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I feel like the technology as well as we've mentioned, can help us understand the things that we're missing. It can help us make things in a way that feels better than the way we've made them in the past. I mean, the industrial era has been amazing in so many ways, but we all know there are things that people did in the past that we would love to not have, and I think this era can allow us to do that. So like, think about the work week and whether or not, you like working from home or not. And there are all kinds of problems with that. But there's been a lot of commuting that's gotten cut out, right? And I used to live in LA. I commuted an hour and a half each direction every day. That's 5 days a week, 3 hours a day, 15 hours just sitting in my car, right? And we're cutting that stuff out, right? And those are the superficial ones. There are ones like about, how people work and the way that we kind of subject people to really having all their hours be devoted to things. We might be fortunate enough to work in an area that we're excited about and we love. Tons of people are working just to make a living. I think that's fine, but there are a lot of ways to kind of separate income from work. And, we're going to open up all kinds of interesting possibilities here. And they could be a lot better than what we have.
So this isn't the first book that either of you've written. And I just want to rewind a little bit to some of your previous work because I'm curious how it informs what you've come up with this new book. So starting with you, Carissa, you wrote a book recently called The Secret Language of Maps: How to Tell Visual Stories with Data. And I'm curious if you brought some of the lessons from that or some of your thinking from that, how does data design shape behavior maybe into this new book at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have been interested in data and mapping, which again is like a very broad term to include all sorts of charts and infographics and data stories. That's been a thread throughout my whole career. I used to be a geologist before I became a designer, and that type of mapping and seeing the world has always been ever present for me. Specifically in Assembling Tomorrow, mapping shows up as a tactic for how to curb runaway design. Scott mentioned earlier about mapping being one method for very spatial thinking that we offer in the book. Also, mapping really makes us work our hippocampus in a very active, practical way if you were a person orienting through space. And it is a part of the brain that has literally withered in many of us since the advent of turn-by-turn directions. Right? It's like technology has affected us for the worse in terms of our own abilities to navigate an area. And it's also something, though, that we can get better at. Just last week, Scott and I were in New York together, and we gave ourselves the challenge that for each new destination, we would look on the map where we needed to go, but then we forced ourselves to remember like the directions in order to get there. So there was no looking once you set out. And we had to just trust that we would make it there. And I think we got better at it as we went, right? Like even in that short amount of time, we were practicing and getting better. So for me, both thinking of what mapping does for us in terms of humans navigating the world, as well as using it as a way to process the data that we have around us, how to think of problems in new ways has been a through line for me into this book for sure.
It's funny you mentioned that map example, and I just remember how much I used to lean on paper maps, and I still have some paper maps in the car in case the shit goes down and we don't have internet anymore. But thinking about my kids who've never, never really used, they've seen paper maps, but never really used them. And you can even go more extreme. Like I used to do a lot of backpacking, and we'd have to do wayfinding with a compass and a map. And those are skills that I think we could very well be losing. So yeah, that's really interesting area to explore.
Yeah, and Scott, your book Make Space, that is also feels very relevant to this topic. How does space influence our behavior, and how does that create opportunities for collaboration? Curious how those lessons carry forward into this current book.
I think those lessons carry forward in a couple of ways. One is just from the very high level. When I started working in design, and I think this is true for almost everybody who does, I just wanted to know how to make things, like how do you get something into the world? When I started working on space, particularly space for work and education, where you're kind of hoping to have certain behaviors come out of the things that you make, I got interested in the opposite side of that, which is how do the things we make affect us? Not just how to make the things we live with, but how to live with the things we make. And this book is a lot about that, right? It's a lot about like, well, what happens when we put something into the world? How does that affect things? What are the cause and effect chains that come out? And, do we do things intentionally or not? And then secondly, I would say just on like the more granular level is the things we make have such an impact on us. I think if there's anything I'm sort of passionate about right now, it's just how little tweaks in things can have such a profound influence on what we do, right down to, the color of something or the angle of something. I was out here talking to a student outside my gate, and I have this weird, they built this fence outside my house because it was in the middle of a construction project. They never took the fence down. So I have this door that's just absolutely gigantic. It's like 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall. And I open it, and when I open it, it's like very daunting. It's like opening the gate to the castle. And so like an undergrad will come to talk to me, and it's already like intimidating for them to talk. And then I open
You need
up
a
this
lurch costume.
Exactly. It's exactly it. And the door creaks and I open it up. So immediately I swing it all the way open, right? So they could just see in. And then it goes from being this sort of big barrier to being this opening where you could walk in and you can see into my yard and I'm not hiding anything. So I go from this intimidating thing to actually this like really expansive open thing. And just every detail like that, it just makes such a big difference. We don't really catch it.
So you've got this book coming out, and you have great books that will link people to from your prior work. Are there any books right now that are both exciting to you? They don't have to be within the domain of work, or it could be something else like a show or podcast.
Well, I always love talking about what I've read recently because it's top of mind. So I just in the last week finished this book by Patricia Lockwood. I think it came out about in 2001 or 2 called No One Is Talking About This. And it's fiction. And it is written in these micro bursts that we take in, like little phrases, like in the same way that you might watch a 10-second video. It's like this paragraph, and then there's this paragraph. And so like the book is written in that same frenetic internet pace. And it chronicles a woman as this fictional place called the Portal is coming into being, which is a clear parallel for the internet, maybe even more amped up. And we see how this portal is affecting her through how she's speaking and what she's doing there. And then something very real happens in her life with her family. Something very human and very tragic happens. And you see her wrestling between these two very different spheres. And it both really hit me emotionally because of the events that follow in her life. They feel very human, but also on this higher level because I could just see that happening to me, right? I could see myself getting swallowed in watching all these videos. And what does that say about me, right? Like, what am I doing? It makes you question a lot of our decisions and a lot of our habits and what really matters to us. I'd recommend it. It's not a long read. It'll hit you in all the places. I think fiction often does that. That's why we have fiction in our book. So yeah, that's my recommendation for right now.
Yeah, I would say I'm really reluctant to share this one. So watch at your own risk. The reason being is it may increase your anxiety, and I'm not sure that's a good thing. But I thought it is so spot on in its predictions. There's a show that I think came out in about 2019. I want to say it was on HBO called Years and Years. It's a British show. And it's basically takes place right around then. And then I think it's each episode goes forward about 5 years. And you just see how things unfold over the near future, everything from politics to technology. And I have to say, first of all, they kind of nail a bunch of it, especially if you know when it was made. So you know what they were projecting and you can see what happens. And then secondly, it's just the stories in our book, we tried to make them about the future, but about everyday life in the future. And this movie is about that, where it's a little dystopian, I would say. There's never full dystopia, never full utopia. It's kind of like good and bad, and this kind of exists in that place. So I'm very much into the shows that are about the future, but in a mundane kind of way. And Years and Years definitely hits that.
Those both sound great, and I'm curious to check them out. I have a book that sort of bridges both those ideas. Have any of you heard about This Is How You Lose the Time War?
No.
Okay, short book. It's written by two different authors, Amal El-Motar and Max Gladstone. And they essentially are exchanging letters back and forth. And they're both from sort of two paths that humanity take that are currently warring with each other. Really cool. I mean, it's conceptually really cool, but very well executed too. So sounds like it has a little ingredient of each of your suggestions in it.
Hearing that style, have you read Trust by Hernan Diaz?
Mm-mm.
That also came out within the last couple of years, but it's the same story written from these multiple perspectives. It is, it's so good. I mean, it's on probably my top 5 from the last couple of years.
I'm going to throw another one out here since we're suggesting books. Have either of you read anything by Peter Turchin?
I have not.
No.
So he wrote a book that came out recently. It has an ominous title. It's called End Times.
Oh.
But the concept of what he's doing is all based on cliodynamics. So it's like data science about economics, history, mathematical modeling, cultural evolution. It's not unlike the premise in Isaac Asimov's Foundation of like sort of using math and modeling to predict the future and find these patterns. So this book is about patterns and archetypes, and it's a nonfiction book. And it's sort of saying like, here's the next 10, 15 years, what will unfold. So fascinating book. Where can people learn more about you and your books?
You can find information about the D.school at dschool.stanford.edu and about the books at dschool.stanford.edu/books.
Well, Carissa and Scott, thank you so much for being on the Design Better podcast. It was a pleasure having you here.
Thank you so much for having us. I loved our conversation.
Thank you both.
This episode was produced by Eli Woolery and me, Aaron Walter, with engineering and production support from Brian Paik of Pacific Audio. If you found this episode useful, we hope that you'll leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to finer shows. Or simply drop a link to the show in your team's Slack channel, designbetterpodcast.com. It'll really help others discover the show. Until next time.